You know, the wind always howled the loudest down the jagged spine of the Colorado Territory, biting straight through the thin wool of Elinor's shawl. She was a widow of 3 months, completely abandoned by a town that saw her deep grief as a burden, and her fragile beauty as a threat. They did not care if she froze out there. The apothecary sent her up the treacherous incline of Blackwood Ridge to gather bitterroot just as the first winter frost hit. Her fingers were numb, pale as parchment against the dark, frozen earth. She reached for a twisted root clinging to the steep rocks. Her worn leather boots slipped on a patch of slick black ice. The world tilted sideways. Panic seized her throat. The jagged rocks below rushed up to claim her. Then the air shifted. A massive hand, thick with calluses and radiating an impossible heat, closed firmly around her slender wrist. Another arm, thick as a pine trunk, wrapped completely around her trembling waist. She slammed not into unforgiving stone, but against a chest that felt like a mountain of solid muscle. Callahan did not even stumble. The giant cowboy anchored himself against the gale, holding her suspended over the deadly drop with effortless strength. He pulled her flush against him, absolutely refusing to let go. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up, fully expecting a harsh reprimand. Instead, she found stormy gray eyes staring down at her, filled with a fierce, quiet terror that she had almost fallen. Before we go any further down this icy mountain trail, if you are finding yourself drawn into this story of unexpected protection, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us keep these frontier tales alive and glowing by the hearth for you. Now let us step right back into that biting Colorado wind. Elinor hung there over the abyss, her toes scraping against nothing but the violent, empty air of the canyon. The wind screamed through the gorge, tearing at her faded morning dress, trying desperately to claim her. But the immense, unyielding force wrapped around her waist absolutely refused to negotiate with the storm. Callahan pulled her upward. They kept a smooth, terrifying surge of raw power. He did not yank her. He did not go her over the jagged stones to bruise her delicate knees. He simply lifted her entire, fragile weight, as if she were made of nothing more than dried prairie grass, swinging her safely over the treacherous edge, and planting her firmly onto the solid, snow-packed earth of the trail. The moment her boots touched the ground, her knees completely buckled. The adrenaline that had kept her frozen in terror suddenly vanished, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion that she could no longer fight. She collapsed inward, fully expecting to hit the unforgiving frozen mud. But she never made it that far. That same massive, calloused hand caught her shoulder, steadying her with a gentleness that completely defied his towering mountain-like stature. Callahan dropped down onto one knee beside her in the howling snow. The sheer size of him blocked out the violent wind entirely, casting her in a sudden, quiet shadow that felt warmer than any hearth fire she had known in months. Elinor squeezed her eyes shut, instinctively shrinking away, bracing her slender arms over her head. Her entire life, and especially the cruel months following her sudden widowhood, had taught her one brutal lesson. Clumsiness was a sin, and vulnerability was always met with harsh reprimand or absolute disgust. The apothecary who had sent her up here had called her a useless, fragile burden just that morning. She waited for the giant cowboy to yell at her. She waited for the rough shake, the angry demand of what a foolish, delicate woman was doing, climbing Blackwood Ridge in a winter gale. She held her breath, her frail chest shivering violently beneath the thin, threadbare knit of her shawl. But the harsh words never came. The silence between them, beneath the roaring wind, stretched out into a heavy, watchful eternity. Elinor slowly forced her dark, tear-filled eyes open. Callahan was not looking at her hot anger. He was not sneering. He was kneeling in the freezing snow, completely ignoring the ice soaking into his canvas trousers, just watching her with those intense, stormy gray eyes. There was no pity in his gaze. Pity was cheap. Pity was what the townswoman offered, before they turned their backs and gossiped about her destitution. What she saw in the rugged, weather-beaten face of this giant was a profound, quiet fury, directed entirely at the elements that had dared to threaten her. He slowly reached out. Elinor flinched, a tiny broken gasp escaping her blue lips. Callahan instantly froze. He stopped his hand mid-air, recognizing the deep, agonizing trauma written across her pale, terrified features. He pulled his hand back, resting it heavily on his own knee, giving her the space she desperately needed. He understood, without a single word spoken, that she was a woman who expected the world to hurt her. The wind howled again, driving a spray of biting sleet against Elinor's cheeks. She shivered so hard her teeth rattled, her slender frame shaking violently. Callahan did not ask for permission this time, but his movements were incredibly slow, deliberately telegraphed, so as not to startle her further. He stood up, towering over her like a guardian oak, and began unbuttoning his heavy, dark brown leather duster. He stripped it off, his broad, incredibly muscular shoulders shifting beneath his faded flannel shirt, seemingly entirely immune to the freezing temperature. He stepped close and draped the massive leather coat over her trembling shoulders. The duster was enormous. It swallowed her petite frame whole, the heavy hem dragging across the snow, the broad lapels folding over her chest like a fortress. The immediate overwhelming heat, radiating from the thick sheepskin lining, hit her like a physical wave. It smelled intensely of wood smoke, raw pine, dried sweetgrass, and the deep comforting scent of fresh snow and leather. It smelled of safety. Elinor reached up with numb, trembling fingers, clutching the heavy collar of the coat closer to her chin. The profound, undescribable warmth of it brought a sudden, stinging rush of tears to her eyes. No one had offered her warmth in a very long time. No one had looked at her and seen a human being worthy of protecting. Callahan looked down at her, his jaw tight, assessing the dangerous purple hue of her lips and the deathly pallor of her porcelain skin. He knew they could not stay on this ridge. The winter storm was escalating, burying the narrow trail in thick, treacherous drifts. He gestured with a massive tilt of his head back down the mountain, his intention clear. They needed to move. Elinor nodded weakly, attempting to push herself up from the snow. As she struggled to her feet, her numb fingers fumbled against the deep pockets of her worn morning dress. Something slipped from her grasp, tumbling down into the harsh, rocky snowpack with a sharp, sickening clatter. Elinor froze, a fresh wave of absolute panic washing over her. She dropped to her knees again, frantically digging through the freezing snow with her bare, bruised hands. It was just a mirror, a small, cheap, silver-backed pocket mirror. The glass was already fractured down the center, distorting whatever reflection it caught. But to Elinor, it was the only piece of her mother she had left in this brutal world. It was the only tangible proof that she had once been loved, deeply and unconditionally, before the frontier and widowhood had stripped her of everything. The townspeople had mocked her for carrying it, laughing at the destitute widow staring into a broken glass. She clawed at the ice, sobbing softly, terrified that the steep incline had swallowed it forever. A shadow fell over her frantic hands. Callahan had stopped. He watched her desperate, bleeding fingers scraping against the ice. He knelt beside her again. He did not roll his eyes at her sudden hysteria over a trinket. He did not tell her to leave it and hurry. With agonizing care, he reached his massive, gloved hands into the snowdrift, just inches from the steep drop-off. He brushed away the heavy snow, his thick fingers moving ve capite hat, a surprising surgical precision. He found the small silver oval. He picked it up, cradling it in his massive palm as if it were made of spun sugar. He slowly peeled off his heavy leather riding glove with his teeth. Then, using his bare, heavily calloused thumb, Callahan gently and meticulously wiped the dirt and ice from the cracked surface of the mirror. He polished it against his flannel shirt, making absolutely sure it was clean. He looked at the fractured reflection for a long moment, then looked down at the fragile, weeping woman at his feet. He held it out to her. He did not duet hand it back. He presented it to her with an absolute, unwavering reverence. Elinor stared at the massive, scarred hand offering her the broken mirror. The contrast was staggering. His hand was large enough to crush stones. Yet he was holding her most precious, fragile possession, with the tenderness of a man holding a newborn bird. She reached out with trembling fingers and took the mirror, clutching it tightly to her chest, beneath the heavy leather of his coat. She looked up into his stormy gray eyes, a silent, profound gratitude breaking through the wall of trauma she had built around her heart. Callahan gave a single, firm nod. He understood the weight of broken things. He understood that sometimes The things that are fractured need the most protection. The storm intensified, the wind shrieking through the pines like a choir of lost souls. The temperature plummeted further, freezing the snow into a slick, impenetrable sheet of ice. Elinor tried to take a step down the trail, but her frozen boots found no purchase. She slipped, her exhausted ankle giving way. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the painful impact, waiting for the inevitable frustration from the man who was now burdened with her. But the impact never came. Callahan caught her effortlessly, his thick arm wrapping around her waist, stabilizing her immediately. He looked down at her small ice-caked boots, then at the steep, treacherous mile of trail still winding down the mountain. He made a quiet, decisive sound deep in his chest. Before Elinor could even gasp, Callahan shifted his stance, bending down and scooping her entirely into his arms. He lifted her against his broad chest as easily as a man might lift a bundle of kindling. Elinor stiffened in sheer panic, her hands automatically bracing against his solid, muscular shoulders. She was terrified of being held, terrified of the sheer physical dominance this giant possessed. But Callahan did not hold her with possessiveness or force. He cradled her. He positioned her carefully, so that her face was tucked securely against his neck, shielded completely from the biting wind, while his massive arms formed a secure, unbreakable cradle beneath her. He adjusted the heavy duster around her, ensuring she was completely enveloped in its profound heat. Elinor held her breath, her heart pounding frantically against his chest. She expected him to struggle. She expected him to complain about her weight, even though she knew she had wasted away to almost nothing over the past 3 months. But Callahan's breathing did not even change rhythm. His stride was long, powerful, and incredibly smooth. He walked down the treacherous, ice-covered mountain path with the sure-footed confidence of a mountain cat. He did not slip, he did not hesitate. For the first time in her entire life, Elinor felt completely, overwhelmingly safe. The sheer size of him, the incredible furnace of his body heat, the steady, rhythmic thud of his slow heartbeat beneath her ear. It all conspired to shatter her defenses. The exhaustion of surviving, the endless, grinding misery of her solitary grief, finally caught up with her. Wrapped in the scent of pine and leather, held securely by a silent giant who demanded absolutely nothing from her, Elinor finally let her eyes close. She surrendered to the exhaustion, burying her cold nose into the warm flannel of his collar, her small fingers still fiercely clutching the cracked silver mirror against her heart. The journey down the mountain was a blur of howling wind and steady, rhythmic motion. When Elinor finally blinked her heavy eyes open, the sheer, violent whiteness of the blizzard had been replaced by the dim, flickering amber glow of lantern light. They were no longer on the mountain. They were walking down the muddy, snow-slushed main street of the frontier town. The town that had turned its back on her. The town that had watched her starve. The town that had sent her up the mountain to fetch bitter root in a blizzard because the apothecary deemed her life worth less than a jar of medicinal salve. Callahan's face was a mask of cold, terrifying granite as he carried her through the center of the street. The heavy snow was still falling, dusting his wide-brimmed Stetson and clinging to his broad shoulders, making him look like an avenging spirit carved directly from the winter storm. Townspeople huddled on the wooden boardwalks under the awnings stopped and stared. Conversations died instantly. The sight of the massive, legendary mountain man, a man who rarely came down from his high-altitude ranch and who was known to possess a terrifying, silent authority. Carrying the destitute, fragile widow of the town through the blizzard was enough to freeze the blood in their veins. Elinor shrank instinctively against his chest, terrified of their staring eyes. She hated the whispers. She can know if they kept what they were thinking. They were wondering why the giant hadn't just left her to freeze. They were wondering what a man like him could possibly want with a broken, useless thing like her. Callahan felt her tremble against him. His massive arms tightened fractionally around her. A silent physical reassurance that grounded her racing heart. He did not even glance at the whispering crowds. His stormy gray eyes were fixed dead ahead, locked with unwavering, terrifying intensity on the apothecary shop at the end of the street. The apothecary shop was a warm, brightly lit haven of wealth and comfort, a stark, sickening contrast to the freezing misery Elinor had endured just for a few coins. Through the frosted glass window, she could see the apothecary, a stout, cruel-faced man named Silas, sitting comfortably by his blazing iron stove, sipping a steaming mug of coffee. He looked completely unbothered, entirely unconcerned that the delicate woman he had sent into a death trap had not returned. Callahan did not bother knocking. He did not turn the handle. He simply lifted his heavy leather riding boot and kicked the heavy oak door directly next to the latch. The door exploded inward with a deafening crack, slamming violently against the interior wall and shivering the glass in the windows. The brass bell above the door tore loose and clattered wildly across the wooden floorboards. The warm, fragrant air of the shop was instantly violently sucked out into the freezing street, replaced by the howling wind of the blizzard. Silas the apothecary leaped out of his comfortable chair, dropping his porcelain mug. It shattered on the floor, hot coffee pooling around his polished shoes. He opened his mouth to shout, his face flushed ve capite hot righteous anger. But the words died instantly in his throat. Callahan stood in the shattered doorway, filling the entire frame with his immense, towering bulk. The winter storm raged behind him, framing him in swirling snow and deep shadows. He breathed slowly, his broad chest rising and falling, his stormy eyes fixed on the apothecary with a predatory, chilling calmness. In his arms, wrapped securely in his massive leather duster, Elinor looked impossibly small, her pale face resting against his shoulder, her dark eyes wide with shock. The silence in the ruined shop was absolute, broken only by the shrieking wind outside and the heavy, slow thud of Callahan's boots as he finally stepped over the threshold. The townspeople, who had been watching from the street, now crowded hesitantly near the broken door, completely terrified but unable to look away from the sheer, imposing dominance radiating from the giant cowboy. Silas swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously from Callahan's rugged, furious face to the fragile woman in his arms. The apothecary's cruel nature, fueled by years of bullying those weaker than him, desperately tried to reassert itself. He puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim his authority in his own shop. "Well," Silas sneered, his voice trembling slightly, despite his effort to sound commanding, gesturing dismissively toward Elinor. "Mort see you found the stray." The clumsy little fool probably tripped over her own 2 feet again. "You can just toss her over there by the counter, Callahan. I ain't paying her full price for the roots if she ruined them." Callahan stopped dead in the center of the room. The absolute stillness that fell over the giant man was far more terrifying than any violent outburst. He did not yell. He did not draw the heavy iron on his hip. He slowly, gently lowered Elinor to her feet, keeping one massive arm securely around her waist to ensure she could stand. He stepped smoothly in front of her, entirely eclipsing her delicate frame with his immense body, shielding her completely from the apothecary's cruel gaze. Then, Callahan reached into his heavy canvas trousers, his stormy eyes locking onto the trembling apothecary, and did something that made the entire town gasp in absolute, breathless shock. Callahan reached deep into the heavy canvas pocket of his trousers, his movements slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. He did not pull a heavy iron revolver, nor did he draw the formidable hunting knife strapped to his thigh. The giant cowboy knew that violence was the language of small, desperate men, and he was neither. He pulled out a thick, tightly drawn leather pouch that looked incredibly heavy, the worn rawhide strings dangling from his massive fingers. He held it out over the shattered porcelain and the steaming puddle of spilled coffee at the apothecary's polished leather shoes. Then, with a slow, terrifying flick of his thick thumb, he loosened the strings and upended the bag. A heavy, cascading waterfall of solid raw gold nuggets and minted double eagles tumbled through the warm air of the shop. The sound was deafening. The heavy gold slammed against the wooden floorboards, ve capite hot. A series of sharp, incredibly heavy thuds, bouncing and rolling into the corners of the room, glittering with absolute, overwhelming wealth beneath the flickering amber glow of the oil lanterns. You have to understand, out on the frontier, a single one of those gold pieces could buy a man a prime herd of cattle or 100 acres of fertile riverfront land. Callahan had just dropped a king's ransom into the spilled coffee of a petty, cruel shopkeeper. The entire town, huddled in the freezing doorway, let out a collective, breathless gasp. Silas the apothecary stood entirely frozen, his round face draining of all color, his greedy eyes wide and completely unblinking as he stared at the fortunes scattered across his floor. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words, but his throat had completely seized in sheer terror and awe. Callahan's voice finally broke the absolute, suffocating silence of the room, rumbling low and deep from his massive chest, echoing off the glass jars and wooden shelves like the warning thunder of an approaching avalanche. He spoke softly, demanding that the apothecary listen closely. Every single debt the widow owed in this town was now paid in full. Her account was closed. Furthermore, he informed the trembling man that from this moment forward, the mountain pass was completely sealed to anyone who carried Silas's name. If the apothecary, or anyone in this valley who had mocked the fragile woman trembling behind him, ever needed timber for their fires, beef for their bellies, or safe passage through the high country when the harsh winter fully set in, they would find the roads blocked and the supplies completely severed. He owned the pass. He owned the timber lines, and now he had just purchased absolute, unwavering respect for the woman they had treated like stray garbage. Silas swallowed audibly, his knees visibly shaking, offering a pathetic, stammering string of immediate apologies, swearing blindly that he had never meant any harm, that the bitterroot was just a simple misunderstanding. Callahan did not even dignify the pathetic display with a response. His stormy gray eyes swept over the silent, terrified crowd huddled in the broken doorway, locking onto every single gossiping face that had ever turned away from Elinor. The message was completely, undeniably clear. She belonged to his protection now, and his protection was an impenetrable fortress of stone and muscle. Elinor stood behind him, clutching the cracked silver mirror to her chest beneath his massive leather coat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped sparrow. She stared at the broad, immovable expanse of his back. No one had ever defended her. No one had ever stood up to the cruel mechanics of this town, let alone surrendered a fortune just to shield her from a petty insult. The sheer magnitude of what this silent giant had just done for her threatened to shatter the fragile emotional walls she had built to survive the winter. She felt a hot, blinding tear slip down her pale, freezing cheek, soaking into the thick wool of his borrowed duster. Callahan turned his back on the apothecary, completely ignoring the fortune left on the floorboards. He looked down at Elinor, the terrifying, cold granite of his expression melting instantly into a profound, watchful gentleness the moment his eyes met hers. He saw the fresh tears. He saw the violent, exhausted shivering racking her petite frame. He did not waste a single word asking if she was ready. He simply bent his knees, sliding one massive arm securely around her waist and the other behind her knees, scooping her effortlessly back into his chest. Elinor gasped softly, automatically looping her slender, trembling arms around his thick neck, hiding her face against his warm collar to escape the staring eyes of the townspeople. He carried her out of the shop, his heavy boots crunching against the broken glass and the frozen snow. The crowd parted instantly, shuffling backward in terrified silence, clearing a wide path for the mountain man and his fragile burden. The shrieking, biting wind of the blizzard hit them the moment they crossed the threshold, but Elinor barely felt it. Callahan's immense chest was an absolute furnace, his thick arms wrapping her in a cocoon of unyielding safety. He strode down the dark, snow-choked street toward the livery stable, where a massive, midnight black draft horse was tethered to a heavy iron post, stamping its massive hooves impatiently in the freezing slush. The beast was easily 17 hands high, a terrifying mountain of muscle and thick winter coat, perfectly mirroring its master. Callahan approached the giant horse, speaking a low, rumbling word of comfort to the animal, before effortlessly lifting Elinor high into the air and settling her gently onto the center of the heavy leather saddle. The saddle was enormous, clearly custom-made for a man of his incredible stature, and Elinor felt entirely dwarfed within it. Before panic could set in, Callahan swung his massive frame up behind her. He did not sit back. He moved flush against her, trapping her small, trembling body securely between the thick horn of the saddle and the immovable wall of his chest. He reached around her kepi, te, hath, both arms to grip the heavy leather reins, effectively locking her in a cage of solid muscle and radiating heat. He gave a soft, commanding click of his tongue. The massive black horse surged forward, its huge hooves churning through the deep snowdrifts, leaving the cruel, brightly lit town entirely behind them. The journey up the mountain trail was a slow, agonizingly steep ascent into complete, howling darkness. The blizzard roared around them, throwing sheets of blinding white snow against them, tearing at the trees, trying desperately to freeze the blood in their veins. But trapped in the center of Callahan's immense embrace, enveloped in the heavy leather of his duster and the overpowering scent of wood smoke, pine, and sweetgrass, Elinor felt an impossible, heavy drowsiness pull at her mind. The rhythmic, swaying gait of the giant horse, combined with the steady, slow, powerful thud of Callahan's heartbeat pressing against her shoulder blades, acted like a potent, hypnotic sedative. The grinding exhaustion of her grief, the lingering terror of the cliff, and the shocking emotional whiplash of being defended finally consumed her. Her chin dropped to her chest, her dark eyelashes fluttering shut, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, fully supported by the giant, who refused to let the storm touch her. She did not know how long they rode through the freezing darkness. When Elinor finally blinked awake, the violent shrieking of the wind had been completely replaced by a heavy, profound silence broken only by the sharp, familiar crackle of a roaring fire. She was no longer on the horse. She was lying on something incredibly soft, completely enveloped in the heavy, luxurious warmth of thick, cured, bare furs. She cracked her heavy eyelids open, her vision swimming in the dim, flickering amber light. She was inside a massive log cabin. The walls were constructed of enormous, raw pine trunks, completely sealing out the violent elements outside. The air smelled deeply of cedar, dried lavender, and the sharp, clean scent of burning hickory wood. She was nestled deeply into an oversized, hand-carved rocking chair positioned directly in front of a sprawling, stone hearth where a massive fire roared, throwing golden, dancing light across the room. It was a fortress. A quiet, impenetrable sanctuary perched high above the cruelty of the world. Callahan was kneeling on the thick braided rug directly at her feet. He had discarded his heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat, revealing the sheer, terrifying width of his shoulders beneath his faded flannel shirt. His rugged face was illuminated by the firelight, casting deep shadows across his strong jawline and his intense, stormy gray eyes. He was watching her chest rise and fall, patiently waiting for her to wake. As soon as her dark eyes fluttered open and met his, he gave a slow, gentle nod of reassurance. He reached out, his massive hands hovering cautiously over her ruined, ice-caked boots. He looked up at her, a silent, respectful request for permission etched into his features. Elinor hesitated, her heart giving a nervous flutter, but the excruciating, throbbing pain radiating from her freezing toes overrode her fear. She gave a tiny, trembling nod. Callahan's hands were incredibly large, heavily scarred from years of brutal labor, yet the way he touched her was a masterclass in profound restraint. He delicately unlaced her frozen boots, his thick fingers working the stiff leather vekep, hot agonizing care, so as not to jar her ankles. He pulled the ruined shoes away, setting them aside, and then gently unwrapped the thin, sodden rags she had used as makeshift socks. When the rags fell away, Elinor squeezed her eyes shut in deep shame, turning her face away toward the fire. Her feet were tiny, painfully thin, covered in dark, angry purple bruises, and raw, blistering patches of frostbite from months of walking the freezing town streets in failing leather. She expected him to recoil. She expected a heavy sigh of disgust at her frail, broken state. Instead, she felt a profound, sudden warmth envelop her left foot. She opened her eyes to see Callahan cradling her bruised, freezing foot directly against the thick, pulsing muscle of his chest, using his own raw body heat to gently draw out the frost. He held her with absolute reverence, his thumbs lightly tracing the unbruised arch of her foot, sending a shocking, electric jolt of comfort straight up her spine. His face was a mask of cold fury, but the anger was not directed at her. The muscle in his jaw ticked violently as he stared at the undeniable physical evidence of the town's absolute cruelty. He quietly promised the empty room that they would never go hungry again, completely ignoring the fact that he was speaking to a woman who had been nothing but a stranger just hours before. He slowly lowered her foot and reached for a small tin basin hearthstones. It was filled, hot steaming water and fragrant, crushed herbs. With excruciating gentleness, Callahan dipped a clean linen cloth into the hot water and began to meticulously wash the dirt, dried blood, and ice from her feet. The sensation of the hot water and his firm, incredibly careful touch was overwhelming. It was an act of such raw, intimate humility from a man of his terrifying size and status that Elinor felt a fresh, painful lump form in her throat. She gripped the heavy fur blanket covering her lap, entirely unequipped to handle this level of pure, unadulterated kindness. The heat of the fire and the absolute safety of the cabin finally began to thaw the ice trapped deep in her bones. But as the extreme cold retreated, something dark and dangerous rushed in to take its place. A violent, rattling cough suddenly tore through Elinor's delicate chest, shaking her entire slender frame. The sheer force of it bent her in half, a terrifying, wheezing sound escaping her pale lips as she desperately fought for air. The deep, untreated illness she had been hiding for weeks, exacerbated by the freezing mountain blizzard, was, finally, violently asserting itself. Callahan dropped the linen cloth instantly. His stormy eyes widening in sudden, profound alarm, he surged upward, his massive frame instantly eclipsing the firelight, moving with a shocking, terrifying speed for a man of his immense size. He caught her by the shoulders, supporting her completely, as she coughed violently against his chest, her skin suddenly burning with a violent, dangerous fever. She was slipping away from him, her eyes rolling back, her breathing turning into a horrifying, wet rattle. He needed to get the restrictive, freezing, sodden wool of her high-collared morning dress off her chest immediately so she could breathe. With desperate, trembling fingers, Callahan reached for the heavy, rusted buttons at her throat. Elinor, trapped in a delirious haze of fever and panic, weakly lifted her bruised hands, frantically trying to push his massive fingers away from her collar, sobbing a broken, breathless plea to stop. But her strength failed entirely. Her delicate hands slipped from his chest, and she collapsed backward into the chair, completely unconscious. As she fell back, the restrictive seam of her bodice pulled taut and tore open. A heavy, folded object, hidden deep within the layers of her clothing, slipped loose and tumbled out, landing directly onto the warm hearthstones with a soft, heavy thud. Callahan froze, his massive hands instantly dropping away from her. He stared down at the object resting in the golden firelight. It was a thick, folded piece of heavy parchment, heavily water-stained, bound shut by a large, cracked seal of dark crimson wax. Callahan's blood ran completely cold. He knew that wax seal. He recognized the heavy, arrogant crest pressed into the wax with absolute, terrifying certainty. It was the crest of the territorial magistrate, the very same corrupt, untouchable man who had ordered the violent, fiery destruction of Callahan's own family ranch 10 years ago. The crimson wax seal sat on the rough-hewn hearthstones, gleaming like a fresh drop of blood in the flickering golden firelight. For a man like Callahan, whose entire life had been carved out of stone and profound, solitary silence, that specific crest was a violent, screaming ghost from a past he had tried to bury beneath a decade of winter snows. The roaring lion clutching a pair of balanced scales. It was the absolute, undeniable mark of the territorial magistrate. A man whose soul was as corrupt and black as the coal seams running beneath the eastern ridge. That wax seal was the very last thing Callahan had seen pinned to the splintered remains of his family's front gate 10 years ago, mere hours before the roaring flames had consumed everything he had ever loved, leaving him utterly alone in the brutal frontier. A sudden, terrifying darkness clouded the giant cowboy's stormy gray eyes. The heavy, protective warmth radiating from his massive frame instantly vanished, replaced by a freezing, predatory stillness. His massive hands, which had been so unbelievably gentle just moments before, slowly curled into tight, trembling fists at his sides, his thick knuckles popping like dry kindling in the quiet cabin. The raw, suffocating scent of phantom smoke and charred pine filled his lungs, pulling him backward into a memory of absolute, devastating loss. He stared at the water-stained parchment, a violent roaring tidal wave of deeply buried grief and cold fury, threatening to drown his legendary restraint. But then a terrible, desperate sound shattered the suffocating silence of the room. It was a harsh, agonizing gasp for air, followed by a wet, rattling wheeze that tore through Elinor's fragile chest. The terrifying sound ripped Callahan straight out of the ashes of his past. and slammed him violently back into the present moment. The ghost of the magistrate could wait. The delicate, broken woman bleeding out her last ounces of strength in his rocking chair could not. Callahan instantly uncurled his fists, shoving the crushing weight of his history deep down into the iron vault of his chest. He reached down and blindly kicked the heavy parchment across the wooden floorboards, sending it sliding far away into the dark shadows near the door. He completely refused to let the poison of that man infect the pure, desperate need to save the fragile life trembling before him. He turned his complete, terrifying focus entirely onto Elinor. The fever had spiked kept at a shocking, violent speed. Her pale, porcelain skin now flushed with a dangerous burning crimson. Her dark, sorrowful eyes were rolled back, her small, bruised hands twitching frantically against the heavy bear furs draped across her lap. The biting cold of the blizzard outside had finally surrendered to the deep, lingering sickness she had been harboring in her undernourished lungs for weeks, and her delicate body was rapidly losing the brutal war. He knew immediately that he had to cool her down while simultaneously breaking the heavy congestion in her chest, a deeply delicate balance that required absolute, unwavering precision. Callahan moved through the massive log cabin with a speed and silent grace that completely defied his immense, towering bulk. He grabbed a heavy cast iron kettle from the iron hook above the roaring fire, swinging it out to check the rolling, boiling water. He strode to a massive hand-carved apothecary cabinet tucked into the far corner of the room, his thick fingers expertly selecting dried bundles of willow bark for the fever, pungent eucalyptus leaves for her lungs, and sweet, calming chamomile to soothe her frantic heart. He crushed the dried herbs between his heavy, callous palms, tossing them into a smaller tin mug before pouring the boiling water over them. The sharp, medicinal scent of the deep forest instantly filled the cabin, cutting through the heavy smell of wood smoke. Returning to her side, Callahan realized the terrible dilemma of her restrictive clothing. Her heavy, worn morning dress, completely soaked through from the blizzard and stiff with freezing ice, was trapping the dangerous heat against her core and completely suffocating her shallow, desperate breaths. To save her, he had to remove the freezing armor, but to strip a deeply traumatized, unconscious woman bare went entirely against every single unshakable pillar of honor he possessed. The giant cowboy dropped heavily onto one knee beside her, his jaw locked in intense, absolute determination. He would not compromise her dignity, not even to save her life. With excruciating, agonizingly slow movements, he reached for the torn collar of her charcoal wool dress. His massive fingers, thick and rough from a lifetime of hauling cattle and chopping timber, moved with the astonishing delicacy of a watchmaker. He carefully undid the remaining rusted buttons down her chest, strictly keeping his stormy eyes completely fixed on her fever-flushed face, absolutely refusing to let his gaze drop out of profound respect for her vulnerability. Once the heavy wool bodice was open, he reached behind her, supporting her entire delicate weight with just his left forearm, and gently eased the heavy, freezing fabric kept no her shoulders and off her slender arms. He left her deeply worn, faded cotton chemise completely intact, ensuring she remained entirely covered. He then reached behind him, pulling a massive, incredibly soft mountain lion pelt from the back of the settee. He draped the heavy, luxurious fur directly over her shivering shoulders, tucking it securely around her delicate collarbones to protect her modesty, while still allowing the restrictive heat to vent from her burning skin. Next, he retrieved a bowl of freshly melted snow from the hearth. He dipped a clean piece of white linen into the freezing water, wringing it out in his massive, scarred fist until it was just damp. With agonizing care, he leaned forward and gently pressed the icy cloth against Elinor's burning forehead. She flinched violently at the sudden cold, a weak, broken whimper escaping her parched lips. She weakly raised her thin, bruised hands, weakly attempting to bat his massive hand away, trapped deeply within a terrifying delirium. She shrank backward into the chair, her frail body shaking violently as the ghosts of her trauma seized her vulnerable mind. She began to whisper, her voice a desperate, ragged rasp that echoed heartbreakingly through the quiet cabin. She pleaded with unseen tormentors, begging the apothecary not to throw her out into the street, sobbing that she would work harder, promising she would scrub the floorboards until her hands bled if they just let her stay by the stove. The sheer, unadulterated terror in her unconscious voice painted a horrifyingly vivid picture of the extreme, relentless cruelty she had endured since becoming a widow. Callahan knelt there, completely frozen, absorbing every single desperate, broken plea. The muscle in his jaw ticked so violently, it looked as though it might shatter the bone. His immense chest rose and fell, with a slow, terrifying rhythm as a profound, protective fury settled permanently into his soul. The town had not neglected her. They had systematically, brutally crushed the spirit of a delicate, innocent woman, because she was completely defenseless. He slowly reached out, completely ignoring her weak, frantic attempts to push him away. He did not grab her flailing wrists. He did not use his terrifying strength to restrain her. Instead, he simply rested his massive, heavy palms gently on top of the thick fur, blanketing her shoulders, offering a profound, undeniable anchor of solid weight to ground her spinning mind. He leaned his rugged face close to her ear, lowering his deep, rumbling voice to a soft, vibrating hum that resonated like a purring mountain cat. He spoke to her in a steady, unbroken stream of absolute reassurance. He promised the empty room and her terrified, wandering mind that the cold was entirely gone. He swore upon his kept no life that the cruel men of the town would never, under any circumstances, lay a single finger on her again. He told her she was anchored, completely shielded, and that the mountain itself would crumble to dust before he let anything harm her. The deep, rumbling vibration of his chest, combined with the extreme furnace-like heat radiating from his massive body, finally began to penetrate the terrifying fog of her delirium. Elinor slowly stopped thrashing. Her frantic, bruised hands slowly fell back onto her lap. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, instinctively turning her face directly toward the source of the immense warmth, seeking the safety of his presence, even in her unconscious state. For the next 48 hours, the blizzard raged outside the cabin, screaming against the thick pine logs, and burying the mountain pass in impassable drifts of white powder, effectively locking them away from the entire world. And for 48 hours, the giant cowboy absolutely refused to close his eyes. He remained anchored to the braided rug beside her chair, a stoic, immovable guardian perfectly content to endure the grinding exhaustion to ensure she kept breathing. He continuously swapped the freezing linen cloths on her forehead, his thick fingers always moving with that same astonishing reverence. Every hour he carefully lifted her delicate head, supporting her neck with his massive palm, and tipped the small tin mug to her parched lips, patiently coaxing her to swallow the bitter, life-saving medicinal tea drop by agonizing drop. During the darkest hours of the second night, when the fever reached its most dangerous, terrifying peak, Elinor's body went completely rigid. A terrible, suffocating rattle seized her lungs, and her breathing hitched, stopping entirely for one agonizing, heart-stopping second. Callahan moved instantly. He dropped the cool cloth, his stormy gray eyes wide with absolute, primal panic. He slid both massive arms securely beneath her, lifting her fragile, burning body entirely out of the chair and pressing her flush against his broad, muscular chest. He wrapped his arms around her like a vice of pure, unyielding warmth, attempting to physically force his own raw strength and absolute vitality straight into her failing heart. He buried his face in her damp, tangled brown hair, rocking her, slowly, whispering a fierce, silent demand to whatever god was listening above the howling storm that he would gladly surrender his own life right there on the rug if it meant sparing hers. And then, as the first faint, gray light of dawn finally broke through the frosted glass of the cabin window, the desperate battle turned. Elinor's rigid posture suddenly melted. The terrifying burning heat radiating from her skin broke, replaced by a cooling, healing sweat. The harsh, wet rattle in her fragile chest smoothed out, transitioning into a soft, steady, incredibly peaceful rhythm. She sank completely into his massive embrace, her cheek resting softly against the heavy canvas of his shirt, a profound, undeniable peace finally washing over her exhausted features. Callahan slumped back against the heavy wooden frame of the rocking chair, a long, shuddering breath tearing out of his massive chest. The sheer, overwhelming relief completely drained the strength from his thick muscles. He had fought wolves, braved avalanches, and stared down loaded guns without a single flinch, but watching this delicate, broken woman fight for her life had completely, irrevocably terrified him. He gently, incredibly carefully, lowered her back into the deep cushions of the chair, rearranging the heavy bear furs and the soft lion pelt to ensure she remained perfectly warm. He sat back on his heels, watching the soft, steady rise and fall of her chest in the pale morning light, absolutely certain in that quiet moment that his solitary quiet life on the mountain was permanently, irreversibly changed. It was mid-afternoon when Elinor finally drifted back to consciousness. The transition was incredibly slow, a gentle float upward from the terrifying dark depths of her illness into a warm, deeply peaceful silence. She kept her dark eyes closed for a long moment, simply absorbing the incredible, unfamiliar sensations. She was not shivering. The perpetual, agonizing ache in her bones that had plagued her for 3 long months was completely gone. The air she breathed was incredibly warm, heavily scented Vey Kepite hot-dried lavender, and the clean, sharp smell of a well-tended fire. And she was laying on something unbelievably soft. Panic, an old, deeply ingrained reflex, flared suddenly in her chest. She remembered the steep cliff. She remembered the terrifying, howling wind. She remembered the giant cowboy catching her wrist and the horrifying shock of the apothecary shop. She immediately braced herself for the harsh, unyielding reality of the frontier, fully expecting to find herself abandoned on a cold floor, tossed aside, now that she had become a sick, burdensome nuisance. She snapped her eyes open, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was alone in the main room of the massive cabin. The fire was roaring cheerfully in the stone hearth, casting a warm golden glow over the thick logs and the rustic, heavily built furniture. She slowly, cautiously pushed herself up onto her elbows, the heavy mountain lion pelt slipping down to pool around her waist. She immediately looked down, terrified of what she might find. Her breath caught in her throat. She was entirely decent. Her worn, freezing morning dress had been removed, but she was securely, respectfully wrapped in a thick, clean wool blanket over her faded chemise. Her bruised, painfully blistered feet were completely clean, wrapped meticulously in soft, warm flannel bandages. She reached trembling fingers up to her face, realizing that the grime and dried blood from the mountain trail had been carefully, incredibly gently washed away. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The towering, massively built giant who possessed enough raw power to snap a man in half had undressed her out of absolute necessity, yet he had done so with such profound, unwavering respect for her dignity that she felt no violation, only a deep, overwhelming wave of pure gratitude. She turned her head, her dark eyes scanning the room, trying to process the magnitude of the safety she was currently sitting in. And that was when she saw it. Sitting directly in the center of the massive, raw oak dining table, illuminated perfectly by a shaft of pale winter sunlight cutting through the window pane, was the heavy parchment. The water-stained paper, the dark crimson wax seal of the territorial magistrate. The color drained entirely from Elinor's face, leaving her looking paler than the snowdrifts outside. The fragile, beautiful piece of the moment shattered instantly into 1,000 jagged, terrifying pieces. Her breathing hitched, the panic returning with a violent, suffocating force. She remembered the paper falling from her bodice just before the darkness had taken her. She kept exactly what that seal represented. She knew the absolute, inescapable terror it carried. And now, the man who had just spent 2 days saving her life, the man who had surrendered a fortune in gold to protect her, had undoubtedly seen it. The heavy, reinforced wooden door of the cabin swung open with a soft creak. Callahan ducked his massive head under the doorframe, bringing a fresh gust of freezing air and the sharp scent of pine into the room. His thick arms were loaded with a massive stack of split hickory logs, enough wood to break an ordinary man's back. He kicked the door shut with the heel of his heavy leather boot, locking out the biting winter wind. He turned toward the hearth, and his stormy gray eyes immediately locked onto Elinor. He froze. The giant cowboy stood completely motionless. In the center of the room, the heavy firewood clutched effortlessly against his broad chest. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from her wide, dark eyes. He saw her trembling fingers gripping the edge of the heavy fur blanket, pulling it defensively up to her chin, as if trying to shield herself from an impending blow. And then he followed her terrified gaze directly to the heavy oak table, to the wax seal. A heavy, suffocating silence descended violently over the cabin. The crackle of the fire sounded as loud as gunshots in the tense, unbroken quiet. Elinor stopped breathing entirely, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She waited for the explosion. She waited for the giant man to hurl the firewood to the floor, to draw his hunting knife, to demand answers. She fully expected him to drag her out of the chair and throw her directly back out into the freezing blizzard. The magistrate was a universally despised, incredibly dangerous tyrant, and being associated with that cursed seal was a guaranteed death sentence on the frontier. But Callahan did not yell. He did not explode into violence. His rugged face remained a mask of completely unreadable, terrifying stoicism. He slowly, deliberately walked over to the hearth, his heavy boots making absolutely no sound on the wooden floorboards. He bent down, stacking the heavy logs onto the iron grate with slow, meticulous precision. Once the fire was fed, he stood up, brushing the sawdust from his faded flannel shirt. He walked over to the heavy oak table. He did not look at the letter. Instead, he picked up a small, steaming wooden bowl from the edge of the table, holding a small wooden spoon. He turned and walked slowly toward Elinor. He stopped a few feet away, respecting the invisible, terrified boundary she had drawn around herself. He slowly extended his massive, scarred hand, offering her the warm, fragrant bowl of wild prairie chicken broth. Elinor stared at the bowl, then up at his rugged, weather-beaten face. Her mind could simply not comprehend his actions. He was not casting her out. He was feeding her. She slowly, tentatively reached out with shaking fingers, taking the warm bowl from his massive grip. The sheer heat of the ceramic sent a comforting jolt through her freezing hands. Callahan did not hover. He immediately stepped back, creating a safe, unthreatening distance, leaning his massive shoulders against the raw pine logs of the wall, crossing his thick arms over his chest. He watched her with those intense, stormy gray eyes, waiting with absolute, terrifying patience. Elinor stared down into the golden broth, a hot, blinding tear suddenly slipping down her pale cheek and splashing into the liquid. The profound, unearned kindness this giant continued to show her, even while a symbol of absolute corruption sat on his table, completely broke her. She could not lie to him. She could not hide behind her fragile silence any longer. She owed this massive, quiet protector the absolute, devastating truth. She took a slow, agonizingly painful breath, her throat clicking as she forced her voice to work. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fragile, broken whisper, completely devoid of the terrified stammer she had used with the apothecary. She told him everything. She confessed that her late husband, a desperate and foolish man, had borrowed heavily from the magistrate to buy seed for a failing farm. When the winter froze the crops, the magistrate had not just demanded the gold back. He had exponentially, illegally multiplied the debt, forging documents to steal the land entirely. Her husband had died of a broken heart and a desperate fever, leaving her entirely destitute. But the horrific truth did not stop there. Elinor slowly lifted her dark, sorrowful eyes to meet Callahan's intense gaze. She pointed a trembling, frail finger toward the water-stained parchment resting on the table. She revealed the darkest, most terrifying secret she had carried up the mountain. The letter was not an eviction notice. It was a formal, legally binding writ of seizure. The magistrate had written into the forged contracts that if the debt could not be paid in gold, the widow herself was to be surrendered to his remote estate as permanent, indentured collateral. The absolute horror of the situation hung heavily in the warm air of the cabin. She was not just a fragile survivor fleeing a cruel town. She was actively being hunted by the most powerful, ruthless man in the territory. Callahan remained entirely motionless against the wall, his massive arms crossed, his face carved from cold, unyielding granite. The only sign that he had heard her horrific confession was the dangerous, terrifying darkening of his stormy gray eyes, turning from a cloudy sky into a violent, churning hurricane. Elinor gripped the warm bowl tightly, her knuckles turning white, tears streaming freely down her pale face. She braced herself, ready to offer to leave, ready to walk back out into the freezing snow to spare him the wrath of the corrupt lawman. She whispered a broken apology, stating that the deadline on the seal had expired 3 days ago. If the magistrate's brutal enforcers found Shiva hiding in this cabin, they would not just demand her return. The writ explicitly stated that anyone harboring the stolen collateral would face absolute, fiery destruction, their home burned to ash, just as the magistrate had done to so many others who dared to defy him in the past. The absolute, terrifying threat of fiery destruction hung in the warm air of the cabin, a suffocating ghost that should have sent any rational man running for his heavy rifle, or demanding she leave his property immediately. Elinor gripped the ceramic bowl with bruised, white-knuckled fingers, her heart completely stopping in her chest, fully expecting the giant cowboy to finally realize the catastrophic lethal danger she had brought to his sanctuary. She waited for the panic. She waited for the inevitable, thunderous rage of a man who realized his quiet life was about to be violently invaded by the magistrate's ruthless enforcers. But Callahan did not move. He remained leaning against the raw pine logs of the wall, his massive arms crossed securely over his broad chest, his stormy gray eyes completely devoid of the terror she had anticipated. You have to understand. Out here on the unforgiving edge of the world, threats of fire and ruin were terrifying to ordinary men. But to a man carved from the very granite of the mountain, a man who had already survived the absolute worst the world could inflict, those threats were nothing more than empty, whistling wind. Callahan slowly pushed off the wall. His heavy leather boots made a slow, deliberate, incredibly heavy sound against the floorboards as he walked not toward the door to check for riders, but directly toward the massive oak dining table. He stopped in front of the water-stained parchment. He stared down at the dark, arrogant crimson wax seal of the roaring lion and the scales. For a long, agonizing moment, the muscle in his thick jaw ticked, a silent, deeply buried memory flashing through his intense eyes. Then, with a casual, almost terrifyingly effortless movement, his thick, heavily calloused fingers reached down and picked up the heavy writ of seizure. He did not read it. He did not care about the legal jargon, the forged debts, or the corrupt, binding chains the magistrate had tried to wrap around the fragile woman trembling across the room. He turned slowly, holding the parchment loosely in his massive fist, and walked directly toward the roaring stone hearth. Elinor watched, her dark, sorrowful eyes wide with absolute disbelief, her breath completely abandoning her lungs. She wanted to scream, to warn him that destroying a legal document bearing that specific seal was an act of treason, that guaranteed a brutal hanging in the town square. But the sheer, imposing dominance radiating from his towering frame paralyzed her vocal cords. Callahan stopped before the blazing fire. He lifted his hand, holding the cursed parchment directly over the leaping golden flames. He looked over his broad shoulder, his stormy gaze locking onto Elinor's terrified, tear-streaked face. He held her gaze, demanding, "Je veux que je hat," exactly what he thought of the magistrate as absolute authority. Without a single flinch, he opened his massive fingers and dropped the heavy paper directly into the heart of the inferno. The fire eagerly consumed the dry parchment. The dark, crimson wax bubbled, hissed, and instantly melted away into nothing, the arrogant crest of the roaring lion completely obliterated in less than a second. The heavy paper curled, blackening at the edges before erupting into a sudden, bright flash of blue flame, turning into fragile, weightless gray ash that drifted harmlessly up the wide stone chimney. It was gone. The binding contract that had terrified her for months, the horrific document that dictated her absolute ruin, was reduced to nothing but smoke and dust in the blink of an eye. Callahan turned his back on the fire, his broad chest rising and falling with a slow, powerful rhythm. He looked at Elinor, his rugged face softening into a profound, watchful gentleness. His voice, when it finally broke the heavy silence, rumbled through the cabin like the deep, comforting vibration of a distant summer thunderstorm. He informed her, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation, debate, or lingering fear, that the magistrate's corrupt laws held absolutely zero jurisdiction above the timberline. He stated simply that the paper was gone, the debt was completely eradicated, and the cruel, arrogant men who had written it would find nothing but cold stone and a permanently sealed pass if they ever dared to ride up his mountain. The absolute, unshakable certainty in his deep voice, the sheer, undeniable reality, that he had just casually destroyed the source of her greatest terror without a second thought, hit Elinor with the devastating force of a physical avalanche. The fragile, carefully constructed emotional walls she had built to survive the winter finally completely shattered. She lowered her head, hiding her face behind the warm ceramic bowl, and began to sob. It was not the quiet, restrained, terrified weeping of a woman trying to hide her pain. It was a deep, racking, utterly profound release of months of accumulated terror, starvation, and agonizing isolation. She cried for the husband who had failed her, for the town that had discarded her, and for the sheer, overwhelming shock of finally being caught by someone who absolutely refused to let her fall. Callahan did not rush forward to hush her. He did not offer awkward platitudes or demand she compose herself. He simply stood there, a towering, silent sentinel of pure safety, allowing the violent storm of her grief to finally wash itself clean within the impenetrable fortress of his home. When her heavy, shuddering tears finally subsided into soft, exhausted hiccups, she realized the fragrant wild prairie chicken broth in her bowl was growing cold. With trembling, deeply grateful fingers, she raised the wooden spoon to her pale lips and began to eat. The rich, savory warmth of the broth coated her throat, sending a shocking, immediate wave of vital energy spreading through her starved, exhausted limbs. It was the most incredible thing she had ever tasted. Callahan remained quietly by the hearth, giving her the space and profound silence she needed to consume the meal, without feeling the unbearable pressure of an audience. Once the bowl was entirely empty, he stepped forward, gently taking the ceramic from her hands, his thick fingers carefully avoiding brushing against her fragile skin to ensure she did not feel crowded or trapped. He set the empty bowl on the table and turned back to her, reaching deep into the heavy canvas pocket of his trousers. Elinor instinctively held her breath, entirely unsure of what this massive, unpredictable man would do next. He slowly withdrew his massive fist, stepping close to the rocking chair, and dropped heavily onto one knee on the thick braided rug. He opened his hand, revealing the object sitting perfectly in the center of his scarred, calloused palm. Elinor gasped, her dark eyes instantly welling with fresh, overwhelming tears. It was her mother's small, silver-backed pocket mirror. But it was no longer just the fragile, broken trinket she had dropped in the freezing snow on the treacherous mountain pass. During the long, terrifying hours when he had sat anchored to the floor, continuously swapping the freezing linen cloths on her burning forehead, the giant cowboy had not been waiting. He had been quietly, meticulously working. He had taken a thick, solid piece of deeply aromatic, raw cedar wood and carved a beautiful, perfectly fitted, protective casing around the entire silver back of the mirror. The rich, dark wood completely enveloped the fragile metal, creating a sturdy, deeply polished frame that was incredibly heavy and absolutely unbreakable. The glass itself was still fractured down the center. Callahan had not tried to replace the glass or hide the deep, jagged crack that scarred the surface. Instead, he had meticulously secured the broken pieces tightly together within the unyielding strength of the heavy cedar frame, ensuring that the shattered glass could never cut her fingers and would never, ever fall apart. He held it out to her, his intense, stormy gray eyes locking onto hers with a profound, searing sincerity. He did not need to speak a single word. The immense physical weight of the newly framed mirror communicated everything his quiet soul struggled to say aloud. He was telling her that he saw her deep, agonizing fractures. He knew she was broken, traumatized, and deeply scarred by the cruel world. But he was also showing her, with absolute, physical proof, that broken things did not need to be discarded. They did not need to be replaced. They simply needed to be surrounded by something strong enough to hold all the pieces together until they were safe to look at again. Elinor reached out, her small, trembling fingers tracing the smooth, expertly carved edges of the thick cedar frame. The wood was incredibly warm from being held in his massive pocket, holding the faint, comforting scent of pine and his deep leather duster. She looked at Moat for her reflection in the fractured glass. She looked entirely exhausted, incredibly fragile, and undeniably broken. But behind her delicate, pale reflection, towering massively over her shoulder in the small silver oval, was the reflection of the giant, a permanent, immovable wall of solid muscle and stoic protection. She clutched the heavy, wood-bound mirror directly to her chest, right over her wildly beating heart, a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute self-worth, taking root in the deep dark soil of her soul for the very first time in her life. The next 3 days were a masterclass in profound, quiet healing. The brutal blizzard completely exhausted itself, leaving the mountain wrapped in a stunning, breathtaking silence, buried under 6 feet of pure, glittering, white powder that effectively sealed the Hat's pass off from the cruel town below. Inside the heavy log cabin, time seemed to completely stop. Elinor's strength returned incredibly slowly, fueled by Callahan's relentless, quiet dedication. He fed her rich, roasted venison, hot stewed apples, and endless mugs of sweet chamomile tea. He absolutely refused to let her leave the deep warmth of the roaring hearth, commanding the space with a gentle, imposing authority that made her instantly feel profoundly safe. However, as the dangerous fever fully retreated, and her exhausted mind began to clear, the deep, insidious poison of her past trauma began to violently reassert itself. The town had brutally drilled a single, devastating lesson into her fragile mind. A woman's worth was directly tied to the agonizing, back-breaking labor she could provide. She was entirely terrified of becoming a useless burden. The sheer, overwhelming kindness Callahan continued to shower upon her without demanding a single ounce of payment terrified her deeply. She was absolutely convinced that the moment he realized she was just a fragile, helpless liability, the incredible warmth would instantly vanish, and she would be cast back out into the freezing wilderness. On the morning of the 4th day, while Callahan was outside in the freezing air, his heavy axe ringing out sharply as he chopped a fresh cord of firewood, Elinor quietly slipped out from beneath the heavy mountain lion pelt. Her legs were incredibly weak, trembling violently beneath the thick wool blanket he had wrapped her in. But she forced herself to stand. She desperately needed to prove she was worthy of taking up space in his sanctuary. She found a heavy iron bucket of water near the door, and a coarse, bristled scrubbing brush on a low shelf. Her delicate, deeply bruised fingers struggled immensely with the heavy iron handle, but she managed to drag the sloshing bucket across the floorboards to the center of the massive room. She dropped heavily onto her fragile knees, ignoring the sharp, stinging pain, protesting the movement, and plunged the rough brush into the freezing water. She began to scrub the raw pine floorboards with a frantic, desperate energy, her frail chest heaving, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out across her pale forehead. The coarse bristles tore at the healing blisters on her small hands, reopening the raw skin, sending tiny, bright ribbons of crimson mixing into the soapy water. She scrubbed harder, tears of sheer panic and agonizing physical exhaustion stinging her eyes, completely lost in the terrifying need to justify her survival. The heavy reinforced oak door swung open, the sharp sound instantly masked by the roaring fire. Callahan stepped over the threshold, his broad shoulders dusted with fresh, glittering snow, his breath curling in thick white clouds in the freezing air outside. He kicked the door shut, turning toward the center of the room. He froze instantly. The heavy stack of split hickory logs he was carrying under his massive arm suddenly slipped, crashing loudly onto the floorboards with a thunderous clatter, completely forgotten. Elinor flinched violently at the sound, her slender shoulders hiking up around her ears, anticipating the harsh reprimand for making a mess, for using his supplies, for being in the way. She scrubbed the floor faster, her ragged breathing echoing horribly in the sudden tense silence of the room, desperately trying to finish the chore before he demanded she stop. Callahan crossed the room in 2 massive, terrifyingly fast strides. He dropped heavily onto both knees directly in front of her, entirely ignoring the freezing, soapy water soaking into his heavy canvas trousers. He reached out, his massive, heavily scarred hands moving with an incredibly swift, undeniable authority. He did not grab her wrists, but he firmly, gently placed his enormous palms directly over her small, bleeding, violently trembling hands, completely trapping the coarse brush against the floorboards. The sheer, physical contrast was staggering. His hands swallowed hers completely, immense and powerful, instantly stopping her frantic, self-destructive labor. Elinor froze, squeezing her dark eyes shut, her frail chest shivering beneath the thick wool blanket. She offered a hurried, broken whisper. a frantic apology tumbling from her lips, swearing she was almost done, promising she would clean the entire cabin, begging him not to think she was lazy or ungrateful. Callahan slowly pulled the rough wooden brush from her desperate grip, tossing it carelessly across the room. He reached down his thick fingers and incredibly gently lifted her small, wet, bleeding hands out of the freezing water. He stared at the fresh crimson blood staining her pale skin, a profound, deeply sorrowful frustration darkening his stormy gray eyes. He did not yell. He did not lecture her. He simply pulled a clean linen cloth from his heavy leather belt and meticulously, agonizingly slowly began to dry her bruised, bleeding fingers, absorbing the freezing water with a reverence that completely broke her heart. He leaned his rugged face closer to hers, forcing her to open her dark eyes and look directly at him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, rumbling command that vibrated deeply in the quiet cabin, completely devoid of anger but filled with an absolute, unshakable finality. He told her, staring directly into the deeply terrified depths of her soul, that she was never, under any circumstances, to bleed for her right to breathe in his home. He explained, his deep voice thick with a profound, protective emotion, that this massive log fortress was not a prison she needed to earn her way out of. Nor was it a cruel town where her worth was measured in the raw blisters on her palms. He commanded her to simply rest, demanding she accept that her pure, gentle existence was more than enough, stating firmly that the heavy labor of survival belonged entirely to his broad shoulders, and hers were meant only to be warm. The profound, earth-shattering realization of his words completely dismantled the last remaining fortress of her trauma. He was not keeping her here to use her. He was simply protecting her because he believed, with every ounce of his massive, rugged soul, that she was profoundly worthy of being protected. Elinor slumped forward, entirely exhausted by the emotional revelation, burying her face against the heavy, warm canvas of his broad chest. Callahan instantly caught her, wrapping his thick, immensely powerful arms completely around her slender, trembling frame, lifting her effortlessly from the cold, wet floorboards. He carried her back to the deep safety of the rocking chair, securing the heavy mountain lion pelt firmly around her delicate shoulders, completely refusing to let the cruel ghosts of her past steal another moment of her peace. By the late afternoon, the cabin had returned to a profound, beautiful tranquility. The winter sun finally broke completely through the heavy gray clouds, casting brilliant, blinding shafts of golden light across the endless, glittering snowdrifts outside the frosted window panes. Elinor sat peacefully by the roaring fire, her slender fingers tracing the smooth, deeply polished cedar frame of her completely protected mirror, a tiny, tentative smile finally gracing her beautiful, pale features. Callahan was sitting at the massive oak table, meticulously oiling the heavy, intricately engraved steel of his repeater rifle, the quiet, rhythmic clicking of the metal parts, blending perfectly with the crackling fire, a profoundly domestic, deeply comforting symphony of absolute safety. It felt entirely permanent. It felt as though the violent, cruel world below the mountain had completely forgotten them, leaving them suspended forever in this warm, deeply protected sanctuary above the clouds. But the harsh reality of the frontier was never permanently defeated. It simply waited for the ice to melt. The profound, beautiful silence of the mountain was suddenly, violently shattered. It did not start with a knock. It started with a sound that instantly froze the blood deep in Elinor's veins, a sound she had learned to utterly despise during her darkest days in the cruel town. It was the sharp, heavy, unmistakable metallic crunch of dozens of spiked iron horseshoes violently breaking through the deep, crusted snowpack just outside the cabin walls. Elinor gasped, the heavy cedar mirror slipping from her fingers and dropping into the deep bare furs on her lap. She sat entirely paralyzed, her dark eyes wide with absolute, primal terror, staring at the reinforced oak door. Callahan stopped moving instantly. The oil-soaked rag in his massive fist went completely still over the heavy steel barrel of his rifle. His rugged face, which had been relaxed in the quiet domestic peace of the afternoon, instantly hardened into a mask of pure, terrifying granite. His stormy gray eyes snapped toward the frosted windowpane. The sun was entirely blocked out. A massive, violently shifting, dark shadow fell heavily across the glass, accompanied by the deep, menacing snorts of exhausted warhorses, and the harsh, cruel barking of heavy tracking hounds. A loud, arrogant voice, dripping with absolutely lethal authority, boomed through the heavy pine logs, demanding the immediate surrender of the stolen collateral, warning the giant mountain man that the entire cabin was surrounded by heavily armed deputies carrying a signed, irrefutable writ from the territorial magistrate. The winter storm had officially ended, but the true nightmare had finally found its way up the mountain. The heavy, suffocating silence of the massive log cabin was violently torn apart by the harsh, arrogant shouting of the magistrate's deputies, a cruel reminder that the brutal reality of the frontier was never permanently defeated by a few days of profound, beautiful peace. Outside the frosted window panes, the heavy, crusted snowpack crunched and shattered beneath the massive, iron-shod hooves of a dozen exhausted warhorses. The deep, guttural barking of tracking hounds echoed through the freezing mountain air, a terrifying symphony of pure, concentrated malice designed specifically to strike absolute, paralyzing fear into the hearts of anyone daring to hide within the timberline. Elinor sat entirely frozen in the oversized rocking chair, the heavy cedar-bound mirror slipping from her, trembling, bruised fingers to land silently in the thick bare furs pooling in her lap. Her dark, sorrowful eyes were blown wide with absolute, primal terror, fixed unblinking on the heavy, reinforced oak door. The deep, blooming warmth that Callahan had so meticulously cultivated within her fragile chest over the past 4 days vanished in a single, catastrophic heartbeat. It was instantly replaced by the terrifying, suffocating ice of her past, a violent, roaring avalanche of panic that threatened to completely crush her delicate, newly healing spirit. The arrogant voice outside boomed once more, demanding the immediate surrender of the stolen collateral, threatening to burn the massive log fortress entirely to the ground if the giant mountain man did not comply. Elinor could not breathe. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of her guilt crashed down upon her slender shoulders like a falling pine trunk. She had brought this absolute destruction directly to his doorstep. This massive, silent protector, a man who had surrendered a fortune in raw gold, who had spent agonizing, sleepless nights pulling her back from the very edge of death, was now facing absolute ruin entirely because of her existence. The deeply ingrained, toxic poison of the town's cruelty screamed in her fragile mind, demanding she offer herself up, insisting that her broken, destitute life was absolutely not worth the fiery destruction of this beautiful sanctuary. With a sudden, desperate burst of frantic energy, Elinor threw the heavy mountain lion pelt off her delicate shoulders. She pushed herself up on violently trembling legs, her breath tearing through her pale lips in ragged, desperate gasps. She completely ignored the lingering, painful ache in her healing bones, her entire focus locked fiercely on the heavy iron latch of the front door. She had to open it. She had to walk out into the freezing snow and surrender herself to the cruel deputies. Before they struck a single match, it was the only way to save the giant who had saved her. She took 2 frantic, stumbling steps across the heavy braided rug. She never made it to the third. A massive, completely immovable wall of solid, radiating muscle suddenly materialized directly in her path. Callahan had moved across the expansive room with a terrifying, predatory speed that completely defied his immense, towering bulk. He did not grab her. He did not use his formidable, overwhelming strength to physically restrain her frantic movements. He simply stepped squarely between her delicate, trembling frame and the heavy oak door, dropping his heavy repeater rifle onto the massive dining table with a sharp, echoing clatter that shattered her panicked momentum. He stood there, fully eclipsing the door, his broad, incredibly muscular shoulders completely blocking out the dim winter light filtering through the frosted glass. He crossed his thick, heavy arms tightly over his broad chest, his rugged, weather-beaten face carved into a mask of pure, absolute granite. Elinor slammed to a halt, her fragile chest heaving violently, tears of sheer, unadulterated panic streaming down her pale porcelain cheeks. She looked up into his intense, stormy gray eyes, her voice breaking into a desperate, agonizing whisper. She pleaded with him to step aside, begging him to understand the catastrophic danger surrounding them, frantically explaining that the magistrate's men would slaughter him without a single second thought. She promised him she would be fine. lying through her chattering teeth, insisting that her deeply traumatized, broken life was a completely fair trade to ensure his absolute safety. The frantic, self-sacrificing words tumbled from her lips in a rushing, broken waterfall of profound grief, a desperate attempt to shield the only person in the entire territory who had ever treated her with an ounce of genuine human dignity. Callahan remained entirely motionless, absorbing the violent, frantic storm of her panic with the absolute, unshakable stability of a deeply rooted mountain oak. He let her empty every single terrifying, desperate fear from her fragile chest, absolutely refusing to interrupt her frantic apologies. When her voice finally cracked and faded into a soft, exhausted whimper, the giant cowboy slowly uncrossed his massive arms. He reached out, his thick, heavily calloused hands moving with that same astonishing, deeply heartbreaking gentleness. He completely ignored the heavy, iron-shod boots stomping on his wooden porch outside. He gently cupped her pale, tear-streaked face in his massive palms, his long, thick fingers lightly tracing the delicate line of her jaw, his immense thumbs gently wiping away the hot tears spilling from her dark, sorrowful eyes. The profound, heavy silence between them inside the cabin was completely absolute, acting as an impenetrable shield against the violent, arrogant shouting outside. Callahan leaned his rugged face down, his intense, stormy gaze locking directly onto hers with a fiercely protective, completely unwavering authority. His deep, rumbling voice vibrated powerfully through the quiet room, a low, resonant hum that instantly commanded her racing heart to slow down. He told her, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that he had not spent the last 4 days fighting the frozen jaws of death just to hand her back to a pack of corrupt, cowardly dogs. He reminded her, his deep voice entirely devoid of panic or fear, that the binding parchment was nothing but gray ash blowing through the chimney, and without it, those men possessed absolutely zero legal authority on his mountain. He commanded her to retreat to the safety of the hearth, to pick up her heavy cedar mirror, and to absolutely refuse to look away from the undeniable proof that she was worthy of this defense. The sheer undeniable conviction radiating from his massive frame, the absolute lack of fear in his stormy eyes, finally broke through the terrifying haze of Elinor's panic. He was not afraid. The towering, massively built mountain man standing before her was not a victim waiting to be slaughtered. He was the undisputed king of this hat altitude, and he was completely, profoundly furious that these men had dared to interrupt her healing. Elinor gave a tiny, trembling nod, her small hands reaching up to gently grasp his thick, calloused wrists. She slowly stepped backward, retreating to the deep safety of the oversized rocking chair, exactly as he had commanded. She reached into the thick, bare furs, her slender fingers closing tightly around the heavy, unbreakable cedar frame of her completely protected mirror, anchoring herself to the profound physical proof of his unwavering care. Satisfied that she was securely grounded, Callahan turned away from her, his broad back a permanent, immovable shield against the cruelty of the outside world. He did not reach for the heavy repeater rifle, resting on the oak table. He did not draw the formidable long-bladed hunting knife strapped to his thigh. To arm himself would be to acknowledge that the corrupt deputies posed a legitimate physical threat, and the giant cowboy absolutely refused to grant them that respect. He intended to face a dozen heavily armed, dangerous men with nothing but his bare, calloused hands, and the terrifying legendary reputation that followed him like a dark, heavy shadow across the entire territory. He stepped toward the door, his heavy leather boots making a slow, deliberate sound against the floorboards. He reached out, his massive fingers closing around the heavy iron latch. He did not throw the door open in a violent display of aggression. He simply lifted the latch and pulled the heavy oak door open, with a smooth, terrifyingly controlled movement, stepping out onto the wide, covered porch and leaving the door cracked just enough to ensure the deep, vital warmth of the hearth remained safely trapped inside with Elinor. The biting, freezing winter wind howled across the porch, instantly biting at his faded flannel shirt. But Callahan did not even flinch. He stood perfectly centered on the heavy wooden planks, completely filling the space between the supporting pine columns, a towering, massively built monument of pure, unyielding dominance. The sudden appearance of the legendary mountain man, completely unarmed, and radiating an absolutely terrifying predatory calmness, sent a violent, immediate shockwave of pure panic through the posse surrounding the cabin. The heavy, exhausted warhorses instantly sensed the profound, overwhelming shift in the atmosphere. They screamed, throwing their massive heads, their iron hooves scrambling desperately against the crusted snow, completely terrified by the sheer imposing presence of the giant standing above them. The lead deputy, a notoriously cruel, deeply corrupt man named Vance, sat atop his panicked roan gelding, desperately violently hauling on the leather reins to keep the terrified animal under control. Vance had expected to find a shivering, desperate man willing to negotiate, or a violent, chaotic shootout. He absolutely did not expect to face a man who looked at a dozen loaded rifles with the casual, deeply bored annoyance of a man staring at a swarm of irritating summer gnats. Vance swallowed hard, his arrogant bravado instantly faltering under the heavy, crushing weight of Callahan's intense, stormy gray gaze. Vance puffed out his chest, desperately attempting to reclaim the violent authority he had projected moments before. He shouted over the howling wind, his voice cracking slightly, demanding Callahan step aside and surrender the destitute widow, citing the absolute authority of the territorial magistrate's signed writ. He gestured wildly vacep his heavy iron revolver, making a grand, threatening show of the dozen armed deputies forming a tight, menacing semicircle around the porch, their rifles leveled directly at Callahan's broad, unshielded chest. Callahan did not move a single solitary muscle. He let the loud, arrogant echo of Vance's threats fade completely into the freezing, howling wind, purposefully allowing a heavy, agonizingly tense silence to stretch out across the snow-covered clearing. The absolute lack of a reaction, the terrifying stillness of the giant man, was infinitely more intimidating than any violent outburst could ever be. When Callahan finally spoke, he did not shout to be heard over the wind. He pitched his deep, rumbling voice low and steady, a heavily loaded, dangerous sound that carried with absolute, crystal clarity across the freezing air, striking directly into the cowardly hearts of the armed men. He informed the deputies, his tone dripping with profound, absolute contempt, that they were trespassing on privately owned, deeply unforgiving land. He stated simply that the precious, legally binding paper they were so desperately relying upon was currently nothing but fine gray dust mingling with the pine ash in his chimney, rendering their entire presence absolutely, undeniably illegal. He completely ignored the heavy loaded rifles pointed at his chest, his stormy eyes locking directly onto Vance's terrified, sweating face, systematically dismantling the deputy's fragile, false courage with every single softly spoken word. Inside the cabin, Elinor knelt behind the thick glass of the frosted windowpane, peering through a small, clear gap in the ice. She clutched the heavy cedar mirror to her wildly beating heart, absolutely mesmerized by the incredible scene unfolding on the porch. She watched the massive, unarmed giant completely subjugate a dozen dangerous, fully armed men, using nothing but his sheer, imposing presence and his absolute, unwavering moral authority. He was not fighting them with violence, blood, or heavy iron. He was completely destroying their resolve by acting as an absolute, immovable wall of pure, terrifying honor. The deeply ingrained, toxic lies of her past, the cruel voices that had convinced her she was nothing but a fragile, useless burden, began to violently fracture and break apart under the crushing weight of Callahan's profound defense. She realized with a sudden, breathtaking clarity that this incredible, towering man believed her delicate, shattered life was entirely worth standing unarmed against a firing squad. She gripped the heavy cedar frame tighter, the polished wood anchoring her deeply to this massive revelation. She was not a burden. She was profoundly, deeply cherished. Outside, Vance desperately attempted to rally his terrified men, violently cocking the hammer of his heavy revolver, the sharp, metallic click sounding incredibly loud in the tense silence. He threatened to open fire, screaming that the magistrate would hang Callahan from the highest pine on the ridge for burning a legal document. But before the cruel deputy could issue the command to fire, Callahan completely shifted the dynamic of the confrontation. He did not draw a hidden weapon. He simply raised his massive, calloused hand, pointing a thick, scarred finger, not at the armed men, but directly upward, toward the towering, impossibly steep, snow-choked peaks of Blackwood Ridge looming massively directly behind the deputy's horses. Callahan lowered his deep voice even further, a terrifying resonant warning that vibrated directly through the freezing snowpack beneath the horses' hooves. He calmly, coldly explained that the violent, arrogant shouting Vance had just engaged in had sent dangerous invisible vibrations straight up the steep canyon walls. He informed the terrified posse that directly above their heads, hanging completely precariously over the jagged edge of the upper ridge, was an 80-foot shelf of deeply packed, unstable avalanche snow, completely detached from the bedrock by the recent freezing cycle. He told them, with absolute, chilling certainty, that the sharp crack of a single rifle shot would instantly, violently sever the fragile hold, bringing thousands of tons of completely unforgiving, crushing white ice down upon their heads in less than 5 seconds, burying them all alive before they could even spur their horses. The deputies completely froze, their blood turning to absolute ice in their veins. Their terrified eyes violently darted upward, scanning the massive, looming white peaks above the cabin. The absolute reality of the mountain's deeply unforgiving nature crashed down upon their cowardly minds. They were not facing a man they could simply shoot and leave for dead. They were facing a man who completely understood the lethal, terrifying mechanics of the high altitude, a man perfectly willing to let the mountain itself serve as his ultimate, violent enforcer. The heavy, loaded rifles slowly, automatically lowered, the deputies' trembling hands completely forgetting their deadly purpose, as pure, unadulterated survival instinct violently hijacked their brains. Callahan dropped his massive hand, his stormy gray eyes sweeping over the terrified, broken posse with a look of absolute, final dismissal. He delivered his ultimate, non-negotiable ultimatum. He gave them exactly 60 seconds to turn their exhausted horses around and ride silently, carefully back down the frozen pass. If they remained a single second longer, or if they ever, under any circumstances, dared to bring the corrupt magistrate's name back onto his property, he would not bother coming outside to warn them again. He would simply let the mountain absolutely annihilate them. The complete, devastating psychological victory was instantaneous. Vance stared at the giant cowboy, his face entirely devoid of color, his jaw completely slack with sheer, absolute terror. He looked at the impossible, towering wall of muscle standing unarmed on the porch, then at the massive, terrifying peaks looming above, and finally surrendered to absolute panic. He violently wrenched the leather reins of his roan gelding, digging his heavy iron spurs deeply into the animal's flanks. He completely abandoned his grand arrogant threats, spurring his horse desperately toward the tree line without issuing a single command to his men. The rest of the posse instantly broke, their false courage totally shattered, scrambling frantically to turn their panicked mounts in the deep, crusted snow, racing desperately after their cowardly leader in a chaotic, terrified retreat down the steep, freezing mountain trail. Callahan stood perfectly still on the covered porch, watching the dark, chaotic mass of fleeing riders disappear entirely into the heavy pine forest. He did not move until the harsh, metallic crunch of their iron hooves faded completely into the howling wind, leaving the profound, beautiful silence of the mountain fully restored. He took a long, slow, deep breath of the freezing winter air, his immense, muscular shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as the heavy, protective tension finally drained from his massive frame. He turned around, his heavy hand reaching for the iron latch, and stepped back into the profound, deep warmth of the log cabin, pushing the heavy oak door completely shut behind him. The heavy iron bar slid into the heavy metal brackets with a sharp, incredibly decisive clang, locking the violent, cruel world outside permanently. Callahan turned away from the door, his intense, stormy gray eyes immediately seeking out Elinor. She was standing by the oversized rocking chair, no longer trembling, no longer hiding behind the heavy mountain lion pelt. She stood incredibly tall despite her fragile, petite stature, her small hands firmly clutching the heavy cedar mirror entirely to her chest, her dark, deeply expressive eyes shining with a profound, overwhelming mixture of pure gratitude and absolute, undeniable awe. She had witnessed his incredible, non-violent subjugation of the posse, and the extreme, unwavering protection he had provided had completely, permanently rewired her shattered soul. He walked slowly across the braided rug, his heavy boots making no sound, stopping just inches from her delicate frame. The extreme, massive size difference between them was staggering, but, for the very first time, Elinor felt absolutely no fear of his towering bulk, only a deep, profound sense of ultimate safety. She reached out, her small, bruised fingers gently resting against the thick, warm canvas covering his broad chest, a silent, deeply intimate acknowledgement of the incredible battle he had just fought for her entirely without raising a single fist. Callahan looked down at her delicate, beautiful face, his rugged features softening completely into a profoundly tender, incredibly watchful expression. The immediate, physical threat of the corrupt deputies was entirely gone, vanished back into the frozen valley below. But the giant cowboy knew the brutal reality of the frontier's corrupt legal system better than any man alive. The magistrate was a deeply proud, incredibly vengeful man. He would not stop hunting her, simply because his cowardly men had been chased away by a threat of an avalanche. As long as she was legally considered a destitute widow carrying a deeply forged debt, the absolute terror of the town would constantly hang over her fragile head like a rusted, heavy blade. Callahan slowly reached his massive hand into the deep pocket of his heavy canvas trousers. He did not pull out another bag of gold, nor did he offer another deeply carved piece of defensive armor. He pulled out a single, heavily folded piece of pristine white parchment, its edges crisp and entirely untouched by the harsh elements of the mountain. He unfolded it meticulously, his thick fingers moving with that same astonishing reverence, and held it out gently toward her. Elinor looked down, her breath catching violently in her throat, as she read the heavy, formal black ink stamped across the top of the crisp paper. It was a completely blank, fully authenticated territorial marriage certificate, signed perfectly in advance by a traveling circuit judge, who owed Callahan a profound, life-saving debt from a brutal winter 5 years prior. Callahan's deep, rumbling voice vibrated softly through the quiet cabin, completely shattering the remaining fragments of her old, terrifying life. He told her, his stormy gray eyes locked fiercely onto hers with absolute, unshakable devotion, that he had built a physical fortress out of heavy pine and solid stone to keep her safe from the winter, to permanently, completely annihilate the magistrate's legal claim over her life. They needed to build a fortress entirely out of ink. Elinor stood completely spellbound in the middle of the warm cabin, her dark eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the crisp white parchment resting within the massive palm of the giant cowboy. The elegant black script of the territorial marriage certificate seemed to hum with a strange, undeniable power under the flickering amber glow of the oil lanterns. Callahan did not push the paper toward her, nor did he step into her personal space to pressure her into a sudden decision. He simply held it out with a quiet, reverent stability, waiting for her mind to process the immense weight of what he was offering. He explained to her, in a low, rumbling voice that resonated deeply against the heavy log walls, that under the strict legal codes of the Western Territory, a married woman was considered a completely separate legal entity regarding prior obligations. He told her that a husband's current property could never be seized for a widow's past debts, and more importantly, a wife could never be claimed as indentured collateral by any creditor if she was legally bound to another man. By placing her name alongside his on that authenticated document, she would instantly transform from a destitute, hunted survivor into the legal co-owner of the massive Blackwood Ridge ranch. She would be wrapping herself in an impenetrable legal fortress of ink and state law that even the corrupt magistrate could not violate without facing the immediate, severe wrath of the federal circuit court. He told her very softly that he was not asking for her heart before she was ready to give it, nor was he attempting to trap her in a union born of sheer desperation. He was simply offering her his name as an unyielding shield, an iron wall that would permanently shatter the terrifying chains the town had tried to wrap around her delicate body. The profound, overwhelming selflessness of his offer struck Elinor with the devastating force of a physical blow, causing her frail chest to heave as a fresh wave of hot, blinding tears blurred her vision. She looked up from the crisp paper to his rugged, weather-beaten face, searching the intense, stormy gray of his eyes for even the slightest hint of hidden resentment, selfishness, or possessiveness. She found absolutely nothing but a pure, unyielding devotion and a quiet, watchful honor that made her heart give a violent, joyous leap against her ribs. For 3 agonizing months, the world had treated her as nothing more than a broken object to be bartered away, a useless burden to be discarded in the freezing mud, or a piece of property to be hunted down by a ruthless tyrant. Now, this towering giant of a man, a legendary protector of the high country who owed her absolutely nothing, was calmly offering to bind his entire life, his immense land, and his unshakable reputation to her fragile existence, just to ensure she could breathe a single breath without fear. She felt a deep, powerful shift occur within the hidden depths of her soul, a sudden, beautiful realization that she was no longer alone in the dark. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her small, flannel-wrapped feet moving across the thick, braided rug until she was standing closer to his immense, heat-radiating frame than she had ever dared before. She reached out, her small, trembling hand, her delicate fingers lightly brushing against the heavy, calloused edge of his palm, and she whispered to him that she would sign the paper. She told him that she was not just seeking a clever hiding place from the corrupt lawmen below, but that she truly, deeply wished to belong to this mountain and to the magnificent, silent giant who had shown her the true meaning of human kindness. A look of profound, overwhelming relief passed quickly over Callahan's rugged features, softening the rigid granite of his strong jawline as he gave her a single, firm nod of acceptance. He walked over to the massive oak dining table, clearing away the heavy steel repeater rifle and the oil-soaked rags with a smooth, incredibly careful movement to ensure the pristine paper would not be soiled. He fetched a small, heavy crystal inkwell filled with capite hot dark fluid, and a long, beautifully polished goosequill pen from the low shelf near the frosted window pane, setting them down with meticulous precision in the center of the dark wood. Elinor approached the table, her heart hammering a frantic, excited rhythm against her ribs as she reached out to pick up the slender quill. Her delicate fingers were shaking so violently from the sheer emotional magnitude of the moment that she could barely maintain her grip, and as she dipped the sharp nib into the dark ink, a tiny black droplet threatened to ruin the clean parchment. Callahan stepped close behind her, his immense, towering bulk completely eclipsing the rest of the room, enveloping her petite frame in a physical cocoon of absolute security and overwhelming heat. He did not let her struggle alone. He reached his massive right arm around her narrow waist, his large, heavily scarred hand gently and completely covering her small, trembling fingers, stabilizing her grip on the slender pen with an incredible watchful tenderness that forced her racing pulse to slow down. He did not dictate her movements, but he offered his raw, immense strength as a steady anchor, guiding her fragile touch across the paper as she carefully traced the letters of her name. When she was finished, he took the quill from her fingers and dipped it once more, his own bold, heavy, deeply etched handwriting filling the line below hers, permanently and irrevocably locking their destinies together in an unbroken bond of black ink. The wet ink dried incredibly slowly beneath the warm, flickering amber glow of the oil lanterns, turning into a permanent, unyielding contract that completely and permanently annihilated her past life. Elinor stared at their names joined together on the clean parchment, a sudden heavy sense of absolute liberation washing over her soul, melting the very last frozen shards of trauma that had held her heart captive for so long. She was no longer the desperate, hunted widow of a cruel frontier town who had to beg for a scrap of warmth by a stranger's stove. She was Callahan's legal wife, the co-owner of the vast Blackwood Ridge ranch, and the fiercely protected partner of the most formidable man in the entire territory. She slowly turned around within the secure, warm circle of his arms, looking up into his rugged face, her small hands resting flat against the thick, warm flannel covering his broad chest, feeling the slow, powerful, steady thud of his heartbeat beneath her palms. Callahan looked down at her delicate, beautiful face, his stormy gray eyes dark with an intense, quiet passion that made her blood run hot. Yet he maintained a profound, respectful restraint, refusing to rush the slow, beautiful burn of their emotional connection. The weeks that followed the signing of the certificate became a seamless, beautiful tapestry of quiet intimacy, mutual healing, and deep domestic tranquility. The heavy winter snow outside continued to pack down in thick, impenetrable drifts, effectively sealing their mountain sanctuary away from the rest of the world, allowing the cruelty and gossip of the valley below to fade into a distant, completely unimportant memory. Elinor no longer felt the terrifying, frantic need to prove her worth through agonizing, back-breaking labor. She began to care for the massive log cabin not out of a desperate fear of being a burden, but out of a deep, blooming love for the beautiful home they now shared. She baked fresh, thick loaves of bread in the heavy iron oven, the warm, yeasty aroma filling every corner of the room and blending perfectly with the sharp, clean smell of burning hickory wood. She mended his worn flannel shirts with meticulous, delicate stitches, her small fingers finding a profound sense of purpose and peace in the quiet, rhythmic motion of the needle, realizing that every stitch was a tiny brick in the fortress of their new life. As her physical strength returned completely under his relentless, quiet care, the deep emotional bond between them grew more profound with every passing day. One evening, as the fire roared cheerfully in the stone hearth, and the winter wind whispered softly through the high pines outside the cabin, they sat together on the thick braided rug, the warmth of the flames painting their skin in dancing shades of gold and bronze. Callahan began to speak, his deep, rumbling voice breaking his usual solitary silence, to share the dark, agonizing history he had carried alone in the high country for 10 long years. He told her about the beautiful, fertile valley ranch his father had built kept hot bare hands, and how the corrupt territorial magistrate had used forged land deeds, illegal taxes, and a pack of ruthless regulators to drive his family out of their home. He described with a quiet, terrifying intensity the horrific night the regulators had set fire to the homestead, the roaring flames consuming everything his parents had ever worked for, leaving him with nothing but a burning hatred and the heavy, thick scars across his broad shoulders. He explained to her that he had fled to the highest peaks of the mountain to escape the absolute corruption of the world below, vowing to never let another human being suffer under a tyrant's hand as long as he had breath in his body. Elinor listened to his story with a breaking heart, her dark eyes shining with deep, empathetic tears as she reached out to clasp his massive, scarred fingers. She realized in that quiet moment that their souls were perfectly mirrored, two survivors of extreme injustice who had found their ultimate salvation not in vengeance, but in the fierce, protective sanctuary of each other's presence. The shared vulnerability forged an unbreakable, sacred bond of trust between them, permanently transforming their legal arrangement into a profound, deeply emotional union of two hearts. Elinor found herself standing before the large, wood-bound mirror Callahan had so meticulously carved for her, staring at her reflection in the fractured glass without the old, suffocating waves of shame and insecurity. She was no longer the fragile, hollow survivor who had stumbled blindly on the icy mountain pass. Her pale porcelain skin had regained its healthy, radiant glow. Her dark eyes were filled with a quiet, diamond-like resilience that no storm could ever break, and her slender shoulders stood tall and proud beneath the soft wool of her clothes. She realized the profound, beautiful lesson that her true strength did not lie in her ability to endure cruelty in silence, but in her pure kindness, her capacity to trust this giant man, and her newfound power to set a permanent, unyielding boundary against the toxic past that had tried to destroy her. She was deeply, unconditionally worthy of love exactly as she was, and her giant cowboy had provided the fiercely protected, safe space for her to finally remember her own immense value. The physical distance between them had completely dissolved, replaced by a deep, aching longing that required no words, a slow burn romance that grew more intense with every shared breath, every lingering glance across the warm room, and every gentle touch of his calloused fingers against her skin. They would stand together by the frosted window pane during the deep hours of the night, watching the silver moonlight illuminate the vast, glittering expanse of the snow-covered peaks, his massive arms wrapped securely around her narrow waist from behind, pulling her petite frame flush against his solid chest, providing an absolute fortress of warmth against the freezing dark. But the beautiful, isolated winter could not last forever, and the inevitable changing of the seasons always brought the harsh reality of the world. Below, back to the high country. As the weeks slowly bled into a new month, the fierce, howling blizzards began to relent, replaced by a softer, warmer breeze that whispered of the coming spring. The thick, crusted ice on the mountain pass began to crack and groan, melting into small, rushing streams of clear water that carved deep paths down the steep, rocky slopes, opening the mountain roads that had been sealed for months. Elinor felt a sudden, familiar tightening of panic in her chest as she watched the massive snowdrifts slowly recede from the cabin walls, knowing that the clearing of the trails meant the corrupt magistrate would eventually discover the humiliating failure of his deputies and seek a final, devastating retribution. She looked at Callahan, who stood on the wide-covered porch, his stormy gray eyes scanning the valley below with a cold, watchful intensity that told her he was fully aware of the approaching danger. He did not show fear, but the muscle in his strong jaw ticked ve kep ite a hot, a terrifying rhythmic precision that signaled his readiness for the ultimate confrontation. The legal fortress of ink they had constructed was absolute, but they both knew that a tyrant like the magistrate cared nothing for the law when his arrogance was wounded, and he would undoubtedly bring his entire force to reclaim what he believed was his property. On the final evening of the thaw, the air inside the cabin was thick with an intense, unspoken emotional tension as they sat near the dying embers of the hearth. They Beotehat knew that the peace they had fought so hard to cultivate was about to be violently tested by the arrival of the spring sun. Callahan turned to look at her, his stormy eyes softening as he reached out to tuck a stray lock of brown hair behind her delicate ear, his thick thumb lingering against her vekep, a Romo cheek with a profound, quiet longing that made her breath hitch in her throat. He whispered to her that no matter what rode up that mountain path when the snow fully melted, she was his wife, his partner, and the co-owner of his life, and he would tear the very peaks down to the ground before he allowed anyone to take her away. Elinor leaned into his touch, her heart swelling with an absolute, unshakable courage, ready to stand alongside her giant protector against whatever darkness the valley chose to send. But just as he leaned down, his rugged lips inches from hers in a moment of pure, uninterrupted intimacy, a sudden, terrifying sound echoed through the quiet cabin. It was not the sound of horses or the shouting of deputies. It was a sharp, heavy, metallic thud against the frosted windowpane, followed by the appearance of a dark, bloody handprint smearing across the glass. A lone, wounded rider from the town had managed to crawl up the melting pass, collapsing against the cabin wall, gasping out a final, horrifying warning through the logs that the magistrate had not sent his deputies this time. He had hired a notorious, cold-blooded band of regulators from the Southern Territory, and they were already at the base of the mountain, carrying a barrel of liquid pitch and a direct order to burn every single living thing on Blackwood Ridge to absolute ash. The dark smear of blood across the frosted windowpane seemed to gleam like fresh varnish under the dying amber glow of the hearth, a violent punctuation mark that signaling the absolute end of their peaceful isolation. Outside, the ragged, shallow breathing of the wounded messenger rattled through the heavy pine logs of the cabin wall before fading into a heavy, terrifying silence. The spring te hat of a kep had opened the gates of the mountain, and through them, the absolute worst of human malice was currently ascending the steep, rocky pass. A band of notorious, cold-blooded regulators from the Southern Territory, armed with liquid pitch and a direct order from the corrupt magistrate to burn every single living thing on Blackwood Ridge to absolute ash. Elinor stood completely paralyzed in the center of the room, her small hands clutching the heavy cedar-bound mirror to her chest so tightly that the polished wood groaned under the pressure. Her dark, sorrowful eyes were wide with a sudden, freezing panic that threatened to pull her straight back into the terrifying depths of her old trauma. The image of roaring flames, the memory of her late husband's desperate face, and the absolute horror of being hunted down like an animal by a vengeful tyrant swirled through her mind, suffocating her breathing. But as she looked up from the bloody glass to the towering, immovable figure of her husband, The icy terror in her heart instantly collided with an unyielding wall of solid, radiating heat. Callahan had not flinched. He stood perfectly still by the massive oak table, his broad, incredibly muscular shoulders squared against the impending darkness, his rugged face carved from a block of pure, terrifying granite. His stormy gray eyes did not reflect a single ounce of fear or hesitation. Instead, they had turned into a pair of cold, predatory flint stones, locked dead ahead on the heavy, reinforced oak door. He rumbled a low, deep command from his massive chest, a slow, vibrating hum that resonated through the floorboards, demanding that Elinor look directly at him. She forced her eyes to meet his intense gaze, and what she saw there completely shattered the remaining fragments of her panic. There was no doubt in his eyes. There was no regret for having signed the marriage certificate. And there was absolutely zero fear of the mercenaries ascending his mountain. He was the silent giant of Blackwood Ridge, and he was about to unleash the absolute, crushing weight of his imposing authority upon the men who dared to threaten his wife. He walked slowly toward her, his heavy leather boots making a deliberate, incredibly steady sound against the braided rug. He did not reach for his repeater rifle, nor did he buckle the heavy iron on his hip. He simply stopped inches from her delicate frame, his immense presence casting her in a sudden quiet shadow of pure, absolute safety. He reached out his massive, calloused hands, his thick fingers moving with that same, astonishing tenderness. As he gently took the heavy cedar mirror from her trembling grip and set it safely on the mantelpiece above the roaring fire. Then he cupped her pale porcelain face in his enormous palms, his thick thumbs lightly stroking her warm cheeks, forcing his own immense vitality and unshakable courage straight into her soul. He told her, his deep voice carrying a quiet, terrifying certainty that echoed off the high logs, that she was no longer a defenseless widow running from a cruel town. He reminded her that she was his wife, the mistress of this mountain, and that the legal ink on their marriage certificate was backed by an iron wall of muscle and stone that no amount of liquid pitch could ever burn. He commanded her to sit by the hearth, to keep her heart quiet, and to watch how a mountain man permanently settled a debt with a tyrant. Elinor gave a single, firm nod, her slender shoulders standing tall and proud beneath her wool dress as she sank back into the deep cushions of the oversized rocking chair. The profound, beautiful self-actualization she had cultivated over the past weeks finally crystallized into an unbreakable, diamond-like resilience. She was no longer afraid of the world. She trusted her giant cowboy implicitly, and she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was profoundly worthy of this absolute defense. Callahan turned away from her, his broad back a permanent, impenetrable shield. He strode to the door, lifted the heavy iron bar with a smooth, effortless movement, and stepped out onto the wide covered porch, pulling the heavy oak door completely shut behind him to ensure the deep, vital warmth of the cabin remained safely trapped inside with his wife. The spring wind rushed across the porch, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth, melting pine needles, and the unmistakable, acrid smell of chemical pitch. 100 yards down the clearing, emerging from the dark shadows of the melting pine forest, the band of regulators came to a sudden, ragged halt. There were 8 of them, heavily armed, riding massive, sweat-stained war horses, their faces covered in dark woolen rags, their eyes glinting with the cruel, cold anticipation of arsonists. In the center of the posse, a pack horse carried 2 heavy wooden barrels of liquid pitch, the dark, lethal fluid sloshing heavily against the iron hoops. They had expected to catch a sleeping cabin, to splash their fuel against the logs under the cover of darkness, and to laugh as the flames forced their victims out into the snow. They absolutely did not expect to find the legendary giant cowboy already standing on the porch, waiting for them in the dim twilight, like an avenging mountain spirit. Carved directly from the high altitude, Callahan stood perfectly centered between the heavy log pillars, his massive arms crossed tightly over his broad chest, his wide-brimmed Stetson tilted slightly forward to shadow his intense, furious eyes. He was completely unarmed, yet the sheer physical dominance radiating from his towering frame was enough to make the regulators' horses scream in terror, their iron hooves scrambling frantically against the muddy, melting snowpack as they tried to turn away from the immense, predatory presence standing above them. the leader of the mercenaries. A scarred, brutal man who had spent a lifetime burning out homesteads for wealthy land grabbers, desperately hauled on his leather reins, trying to force his trembling mount forward. He sneered, lifting a sputtering, roaring oil torch high into the air, the orange flames casting long, grotesque shadows across the melting snow. He shouted a cruel, mocking threat over the wind, warning Callahan that the magistrate had ordered the absolute erasure of Blackwood Ridge, demanding the giant step aside and surrender the widow if he wanted to avoid a fiery grave. Callahan did not break his stillness. He let the mercenary's crude threats bounce harmlessly off the hepa pine columns of his porch, allowing a long, agonizingly tense silence to settle over the clearing. The absolute lack of fear, the terrifying, motionless authority of the giant cowboy, began to systematically eat away at the mercenaries' false confidence. When Callahan finally spoke, he did not raise his voice to a shout. He pitched his deep, rumbling tone low and steady, a heavily loaded, dangerous sound that carried with absolute, crystal clarity across the clearing, vibrating directly through the wet earth beneath the horses' hooves. He informed the regulators, his voice dripping with a cold, absolute contempt that made the leader's torch hand tremble, that they were standing on land legally registered to a federal citizen and his lawful wife. He stated simply that the woman they were hunting was currently named Callahan, and that every single horse, weapon, and barrel of pitch they carried was currently violating a federal injunction signed by a traveling circuit judge. He did not threaten them with a rifle. He did not threaten them with a hanging. He simply uncrossed his massive arms, stepping to the very edge of the porch steps, his towering bulk completely eclipsing the light of their torches, and delivered a non-violent ultimatum that carried the absolute weight of a mountain landslide. He told them to look down at the heavy iron shoes of their horses. He explained that during the 4 days of the deep thaw, he had meticulously shifted the heavy timber lines on the upper ridge, cutting away the deadfall braces that held the massive, unstable rock shelves directly above the narrow canyon trail behind them. He informed the terrified mercenaries that the path they had just ridden up was currently the only way down, and that a single spark from their torches or a single shot from their rifles would create an echo loud enough to drop 20,000 tons of wet, jagged granite directly into the throat of the pass, sealing them on this mountain forever, with a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He told them very softly that they had exactly 30 seconds to extinguish their torches, drop their weapons into the melting mud, and walk their horses down the back trail on foot like whipped dogs. If they refused, he would not bother fighting them. He would simply let the mountain absolutely annihilate them where they stood. The complete, devastating psychological victory was instantaneous. The regulators were brutal men, but they were not fools. They looked up at the towering white peaks of Blackwood Ridge, realizing with absolute, paralyzing horror that the giant cowboy was completely telling the truth. The mountain pass was a death trap, and they were caught in the center of his jaw. The leader's face drained of all color, his arrogant sneer twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at Callahan's rugged, granite features, realizing that the giant was perfectly willing to let the rocks bury them all, if it meant protecting the woman inside. The roaring torch suddenly slipped from his trembling fingers, plunging face first into a wet snowdrift and dying with a sharp, pathetic hiss. One by one, the heavy rifles and iron revolvers slipped from the mercenaries' hands, clattering uselessly into the thick, freezing mud of the clearing. They didn't say a word. They didn't issue a single final threat. They violently wrenched the reins of their horses around, scrambling frantically to escape the terrifying shadow of the giant protector, retreating down the mountain pass in a chaotic, silent panic before the rocks could claim their souls. Callahan stood perfectly still on the covered porch, watching the last of the fleeing mercenaries disappear entirely into the dark pine forest, leaving the profound, beautiful silence of Blackwood Ridge fully restored. The corrupt magistrate's ultimate weapon had been completely, permanently dismantled without a single drop of blood spilled, defeated entirely by the giant's unyielding authority and the absolute power of an unshakable moral defense. He took a long, deep breath of the clean spring air, his immense chest rising and falling with a slow, peaceful rhythm as the heavy tension of the past months finally drained from his soul. He turned around, lifted the iron latch, and stepped back into the deep, radiant warmth of the cabin, closing the heavy oak door completely behind him. The heavy iron bar slid into the brackets with a sharp, incredibly decisive clang, locking the cruel world outside permanently. Callahan turned toward the hearth, his stormy gray eyes softening into a profound, watchful expression of pure, unadulterated tenderness. Elinor stood by the rocking chair, her pale porcelain skin glowing under the golden firelight, her dark eyes shining with a quiet, diamond-like resilience, and an absolute overwhelming adoration for the man who had saved her. She did not say a single word. She simply stepped forward, her small flannel-wrapped feet moving smoothly across the braided rug until she was standing flush against his massive chest. She reached her slender arms up, looping them securely around his thick neck, hiding her face against his warm flannel collar, completely surrendering to the profound safety of his embrace. Callahan wrapped his thick, immensely powerful arms completely around her narrow waist, lifting her fragile frame slightly off the floorboards to hold her securely against his heart, a permanent, unyielding fortress of pure love and mutual salvation that no winter storm and no corrupt tyrant could ever break. They had found their ultimate justice, their profound healing, and an unbreakable trust that would bloom forever on the high peaks of the Colorado frontier. If your heart has found a sense of healing and profound peace alongside Elinor and Callahan on this high mountain pass, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to join our frontier family for more tales of unexpected protection and unyielding honor. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment and educational purposes. The characters, events, and situations in this story are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental. This content was created with the help of AI tools and has been carefully edited. All rights reserved.